Why does housing cost so much? And was it always this way? Hello and welcome to a special bonus episode of the Reason Roundtable where we answer even more of your questions. This is not a full-size roundtable, it's just a table for two. I'm your host, Peter Suderman, and today I am joined by Reason Magazine's very own Christian Britschgi. Christian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being on the show. So this week's question comes from a YouTube viewer who wants to know about housing. He writes that it was genuinely easier to buy a house in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Yes, new houses are better houses, but the problem is you can't buy a worse house, so you just end up unable to buy one at all. So, Christian, you have written a huge amount about housing, housing policy, housing costs. Is this a real problem? And if so, what do we do about it?
Yeah, I would say it's a real problem. I mean, it depends on the metric you look at, but price to income ratios in a lot of cities have gone up a lot. Price of the housing to the incomes people are making, the cost of housing is rising faster than the rate of inflation. The age of new home buyers keeps going up and is at the highest rate that it's ever been. In some ways, it's kind of worse.
So the age of new home buyers going up. Why is that? Well, what's happening there to cause the first-time home buyers to get progressively older?
Sure. I mean, so, part of that maybe is just people are, these kind of demographic changes people talk about all the time of people are starting families later and moving into that kind of home ownership stage of their life later as a result. But also a lot of it is just that housing costs a lot more. And so it takes longer to save up for a down payment and qualify for a mortgage. You do that later in life than you could earlier. So it's certainly the listener's question is, he's pointing to a real problem. In fact, in some ways it's worse than how he describes, because in places with the biggest problems, he's right to say that new housing is better, but you can't necessarily buy the cheaper, worse housing today. In the cities with the biggest problems, even the old worse, not new construction is way more expensive. And that's when you really know you have a housing crisis, right? New construction is generally always expensive because new things are more expensive than old things. But in cities that haven't built much in the past several decades, Los Angeles or New York City or San Francisco, what have you, you've had, the older housing is also massively expensive because there just hasn't been new supply. Normally in a functioning housing market, you expect this thing called filtering, which is, new expensive housing gets built. The rich people move into the new housing, which vacates older units, which then fall in price because of falling demand. And then, middle income people move into that. And that opens up even older housing where, poor people move into that. But
so it's a sort of a hand-me-down effect?
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
Where the people who are best off get the newest and kind of plausibly the best housing. And then as they move out of their old, what used to be the newest and best housing, then people who are somewhat less well off can move into that because it falls in price. That's what you're supposed to see, but you're not seeing that.
Right, yeah. So, ideally it would be kind of like musical chairs, but you keep adding chairs, and so people can sprawl out.
But it's the opposite. It's like musical. This is
no,
what's
it's like
happening
actual
in the
musical
market,
chairs, right?
Is musical chairs, except you're taking the chairs away, and you've got more people, and the same number of houses, and so more people wanting houses, right? Wanting housing. With the same number of houses means that people are bidding up the price of all of those houses, not just the new expensive houses, but also the old houses. And this is how you get increasing housing costs and what you call a housing crisis.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah, it'd be called technical term would maybe be a reverse filtering, where the, 70s bungalow that was, built 50 years ago now costs $2 million. As opposed to just the newest housing costing $2 million. And then on top of that, you have the dynamic that the listener the listener question points out, which is that we've also just done a lot of things to make the newest housing that we do build more expensive. That can be anything. There's a lot of different policies that do this, but that could be anything from maybe large minimum lot sizes where a new house has to sit on a whole acre of land. So you consume more land per house. That's going to drive up the price. And if you do that across an entire metro area, then it just means that you can fit fewer homes in the area. So that's just going to limit supply more. There's all sorts of like design and architectural standards that, mean that new homes have to be built to, very expensive. They have to look really pretty and be built to particular standards that raises costs too. There's all sorts of, energy efficiency requirements and environmental standards that raise costs of new housing. The list goes on and on and on. But so we've done both. We haven't built enough housing generally, and then on top of that, we've made the new housing that we do build more expensive. And even in some localities, this isn't everywhere, but in some localities, even you have laws that say new housing has to be of a particular size, like the actual home, right? Regardless of what the lot size is, like you have to build a large home instead.
And bigger houses are kind of by definition going to be more expensive houses.
Yeah,
a 3,500 square foot house is going to be more expensive on average. Yes, obviously location and other features do make a difference, but on average, everything else being sort of held the same, that bigger house is going to be more expensive. The house with a bigger lot is going to be more expensive, and it just makes it much harder to build new housing, to build enough of it to meet the demand of more people.
Yeah, and in some areas, actually, this is it's kind of getting worse. In Texas, for instance, the state just passed a law, a good law saying that localities have to allow apartments and commercial zones, office districts, whatever, basically to allow housing in more places. And some cities are responding to this by saying, well, okay, well, if you're going to force us to build new housing, we're going to require that the new housing have an Olympic-sized swimming pool and a public art installation that costs $4 per square foot of new unit that you're adding, and just all these absurd, luxury mandated amenities, mandated luxury amenities. Just purposefully to drive up the cost of new housing.
So this is a result of a kind of what's been called the NIMBY movement, not in my backyard, which is people who don't want new housing to be built. This typically is homeowners, people who already live in a neighborhood or a city, and they feel that new housing, new construction, especially dense housing, is going to change the character of their neighborhood in some way. And so they're pushing back against it. And I think you wrote an article, speaking of Texas, talking about how NIMBYs they're not just it's the swimming pools. There was one that was required a hot tub or a spa or something,
right,
in every.
Saunas,
tell me a little bit more about that.
Saunas, yoga rooms. It's again, it's the a couple different cities. The Texas
that sounds great.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if you can afford it, it's great. But it kind of undercuts the purpose of the law, which the goal of passing the state law to allow more apartments was we should be able to build, cheaper, inherently more affordable types of housing. And then the locality is responding by saying, well, what if we made that new, cheaper, affordable housing as expensive as possible? And clearly, the goal of this isn't. The surface level justification is, the new housing should be nice housing. But I think the intended purpose is to make new projects as financially infeasible as possible so that fewer of them get built, which is,
and so this is happening in Texas.
Yes.
But I keep hearing that Texas is the place where you can build, where it's a YIMBY success story. Yes, in my backyard, where the pro-development forces who want to build more housing and who explicitly make the case, we need more housing because that's going to bring the cost of housing down. I keep hearing about how Texas is the place where those people are winning.
Yes. So a couple things on that. So firstly, not every city is responding to this new state law I mentioned by, layering on all these luxury amenity requirements, but some are. So there are some bad actors in the state. More broadly, what I'd say is that where Texas has really succeeded is it has very few restrictions on greenfield development, or pejoratively, sometimes you call that sprawl. So you can build new subdivisions in Texas very easily without having to deal with a bunch of environmental review requirements, or counties in Texas, outside of incorporated city land. They're not allowed to zone. And so it's quite easy to just, build, the kind of what you imagine in your head is a typical new sprawling Texas subdivision. It's always been very easy to do that. And that's kept Texas building a lot and relatively, keeping prices down. But unfortunately, Texas, in a lot of other ways, is actually very typical of the rest of the country in that its zoning laws are still pretty restrictive. There's a lot of single-family only zoning. There's a lot of large minimum lot sizes. Those rules I mentioned previously. There's still, design requirements and things like that. Those haven't bitten as much up until recently because, again, there was less demand to live in Texas, and then also just, Texas, you've been able to sprawl. But now that so many people have moved into Texas and there's more demand for density within city centers, the zoning that looks very similar to, other places in, California or New York, that is starting to bite. And there's been some efforts. Texas is a little bit of a latecomer of state laws trying to upzone cities. Sometimes over the objections of local city governments. They're a little bit of a latecomer to those types of laws, but they have made some progress there. So yeah.
Talk a little bit more about California, because California seems to be the epicenter of what's been called the housing crisis. This just total lack of supply, of inventory of new houses and old houses, of total housing to meet demand. Because it even as it has seemed to be the epicenter of the housing crisis, it also seems to be the place where Democratic politicians, at least in some cases, at the state level, are pushing reforms. Are they good reforms? Are they going to work? Are housing prices going to come down in California, especially if you pair this with out-migration, with all of the movement from California to places like Texas and Florida?
Yeah, so I mean, you understand how those two things would go together, right? The place with the biggest problem also has the greatest pushback. So housing costs are really high. It becomes the primary issue in the state. And so a lot of politicians are interested in doing something about this. California has passed a lot of, directionally productive deregulatory reforms allowing. Just recently, the governor signed a bill that, broadly speaking, is going to allow apartment buildings near rail transit stops. They've passed some pretty robust reforms about accessory dwelling units or granny flats, in-law suites, whatever you want to call it, where you can add a additional unit of housing on a single-family lot. Lots of reforms like this. The difficulty with California is. The problem is
that it's California.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a way, yes, right? So the problem is so immense that it requires really far-reaching reform to really make a dent in the high and rising housing costs that you have there. And then additionally, it's like, well, all the interest groups that benefit from the current, restrictive rules and who, help to pass the current restrictive rules are still very much, forces there in the local government and the state legislature. And so whenever you come around to, propose, NIMBYs come around to propose a bill saying we're going to allow apartments in more places, unions want their labor standards, union wage requirements built in. Tenant activists want anti-displacement standards, so you're not allowed to, replace old housing with new housing. Environmentalists.
And they all end up using all of this kind of process that has built up over the years, right? All of this stuff that was supposed to bring communities into the development process, that was supposed to make it environmentally healthy and sustainable. All of these sort of layers of review, they're not even being used to ensure that the environment is better or that the community is happy necessarily. What they are being used is sort of cynically and instrumentally by unions, by other groups who just want to stop things from happening. And it ends up being this sort of, like everybody has a stop button and no one can just say, we're just going to build because we own this land and we're going to make sure it's safe and we're going to make sure that it's not going to ruin things, but we're going to build and we're going to build a big building on the land that we own. Like it's kind of functionally impossible.
Right. Yeah. So the state does have a pretty onerous environmental review law, which again is not, as you mentioned, it's not a substantive requirement about environmental protections. It's a procedural requirement that when you build something, you have to list out all the environmental impacts. And the law there allows third parties to sue if they think you haven't, produced a good enough book report about what your new development will do. And obviously that, creates an incentive for, cynical actors to just delay housing they don't want to see, regardless if they think it's bad for the environment or not. And then also just even more cynical shakedown still of, well, you could hire my union to build your housing project, and that's going to be expensive, but it's going to be more expensive if I sue you and keep this in litigation for 10 years. I should say on that front, the state did, as part of their state budget this year, they did pass a pretty sweeping exemption to their environmental review laws, which basically exclude urban infill apartments built in existing cities from these environmental review requirements. I think that's going to be actually pretty huge. It's pretty clean, straightforward reform. California still has this environmental review law. You look at a state like Texas, another thing that allows them to build all this new greenfield development is that they don't have one of these environmental review laws. And so you don't have to produce a giant book report saying what your new subdivision is, going to mean for the, red-breasted swallow or whatever, which is already protected by other laws. So I think that's probably the most progressive in the, not in the
ideological
sense, but just in the normal use of
forward-looking.
Forward-looking. There we go.
Okay, one last question here for you. You are suddenly given a housing policy genie. Like you find a housing policy genie buried at a development site that's been stopped by a bunch of environmental review laws somewhere, and you're given one housing policy wish. You can pass one law, change one thing, and it can be federal, it can be state, it can be in one city, but you get to make exactly one change. What's the one change that's going to make the biggest impact?
Oh, man. Okay, this is a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could just go big and be like, all zoning is gone. But maybe more in the spirit of your question, this is what I would get rid of. I would get rid of what's called inclusionary zoning, which is effectively mandates that, a lot of states have these where it's like if you build a new apartment building, 20% of the units have to be income restricted, affordable housing. This is it's unconstitutional. It's ridiculous that the courts haven't struck down these requirements in the first place, but they still exist, and they're a huge suppressant on new housing construction because the developer loses money on the income restricted units that they're forced to build. So it's like requiring that a grocery store give away 20% of its produce at money losing rates, money losing prices. This is of course a huge suppressant on new construction, and it's unfortunate because if you ever in any of these states where they have these laws, if you try to upzone and allow more apartments, always one of the concessions is, well, of course, 20%, 30%, 10%, whatever is going to be these income restricted units. And so that just drives down the benefit of any reform that you actually do. So yeah, let's just get all those off the table. That's what I would ask the genie for.
All right. I hope you find your housing policy genie and get your wish. Thank you so much for watching Table for Two with Christian Britschgi. For more bonus segments like this one, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check back regularly. If you'd like us to answer your question, send your short, succinct, pithy, and not very long question to podcasts@reason.com. That's podcasts@reason.com. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you soon.